When Rick Rude lost it, he didn't just break character, he broke people. And the scary part? No one could stop him. In a world where everything was fake, Rick Rude was dangerously real. Wrestling is supposed to be controlled. Every punch is pulled. Every fall is planned. Every outcome is decided before the bell even rings. The promoters write the script. The wrestlers follow the script. The audience believes the script. But Rick Rude didn't care about the script. When he snapped, the cameras kept rolling, and the world watched a man who refused to be tamed. This is the story of 5 real moments when Rick Rude went too far, and wrestling could do nothing but watch. Professional wrestling lives and dies by one simple rule: keep the audience believing. They call it kayfabe. It's the sacred agreement between the wrestlers and the fans that what happens in the ring is real, even though everyone knows it's planned. The whole business depends on cooperation. 2 men pretend to hate each other, they pretend to hurt each other, and they protect each other while making it look brutal. This cooperation is everything. Without it, the illusion shatters. Without it, the business dies. The success of a wrestling match depends on both men working together to tell a story. The hero throws a punch that looks devastating but barely touches the villain's face. The villain takes a slam that sounds like thunder but is carefully controlled to protect his spine. They rehearse the sequence. They call the spots in the ring. They make sure both men walk out healthy enough to do it again the next night. This is the unspoken contract of professional wrestling. But what happens when one man stops pretending? What happens when real pain enters a fake fight? What happens when someone who can actually hurt you decides the script doesn't matter anymore? That's when you get Rick Rude, and that's when wrestling becomes dangerous. Rick Rude looked like a movie star villain. He had the body of a Greek statue carved from marble and the confidence of a man who knew he was better than you. He would strut to the ring in a sequined robe that caught every light in the arena, gyrate his hips in a way that made the men in the crowd furious, and demand that all the fat, out-of-shape sweat hogs in the audience shut their mouths while he took his robe off. His tights were works of art, airbrushed masterpieces featuring his own chiseled face or the faces of his enemies or his rivals' wives. He was called Ravishing Rick Rude, and he played the perfect bad guy. Women wanted him, men wanted to punch him, and that's exactly what wrestling needed. A villain so arrogant, so cocky, so physically perfect that audiences would pay money just to see him lose. But behind the character was Richard Rude, a former bouncer from the rough and tumble bars of Robbinsdale, Minnesota, a world-class competitive arm wrestler with grip strength that could crush bone like paper, a man who grew up settling disputes in parking lots where talking didn't solve problems. Fists did, and when Richard Rude felt disrespected or threatened or injured, Ravishing Rick Rude disappeared. What emerged was something far more dangerous: a shooter, a real fighter, a man trained by Eddie Sharkey in the old school methods of professional wrestling, where you learned how to work, but you also learned how to shoot if you needed to. And Rick Rude needed to more than once. The wrestling business in the late 80s and early 90s was changing rapidly. It was moving away from being a simulated sport and becoming pure entertainment. Vince McMahon, the owner of the World Wrestling Federation, had a vision. He wanted cartoon characters that could transcend wrestling. He wanted larger-than-life superheroes and villains who could sell toys and lunchboxes and appear on Saturday morning television. He didn't want real fighters who could actually hurt each other. He wanted performers who could make it look good. He wanted the rock and wrestling connection. He wanted MTV. He wanted mainstream America. And nowhere was this philosophy more obvious than with The Ultimate Warrior. The Ultimate Warrior was everything Vince McMahon dreamed of. Neon-colored face paint that looked like it was applied by a crazy person. Tassels on his arms that shook when he flexed. A body so pumped full of muscle that it looked like it might explode at any second. He would sprint to the ring at full speed, grab the ropes and shake them violently while screaming at the sky like a madman possessed. Kids loved him. He was a superhero come to life, pulled directly from a comic book and dropped into their living rooms. But there was one major problem that Vince McMahon either didn't see or didn't care about. The Ultimate Warrior couldn't wrestle. Not really. He was a bodybuilder named Jim Hellwig who learned some basic moves, but he didn't understand the most important part of the job: protecting your opponent. In wrestling, they have a word for someone who hits too hard. They call it being stiff, and the Ultimate Warrior was dangerously, recklessly stiff. He didn't pull his punches. He didn't control his power when he slammed someone to the canvas. He didn't understand that his job was to make it look devastating while keeping his opponent safe. He treated his opponents like crash test dummies in some violent experiment. And that made him a legitimate threat to everyone in the locker room, especially Rick Rude. Because in 1989 and 1990, Rick Rude was stuck in a months-long feud with the Ultimate Warrior over the Intercontinental Championship. And Rude was the one who had to make Warrior look good. good. In wrestling terms, Roode had to carry him. That meant Roode called all the moves in the ring while they were happening. Roode took all the real punishment so Warrior could look strong. Roode made sure the match didn't fall apart into an obvious mess. And Roode had to do all of this while Warrior was throwing real punches that connected with his jaw and dropping him with uncontrolled force that rattled his spine. The locker room deals with it immediately. Rick Roode dealt with it the only way he knew how. He didn't go to Vince McMahon. He didn't file a formal complaint. He didn't wait for management to have a meeting. He did what men like him do when words don't work and respect isn't given voluntarily. He took it. Witnesses who were there that night, including Kevin Nash and Barry Darsow, who wrestled as Smash of Demolition, say Roode hit Warrior with a single strike. Some accounts say it was an open-handed slap that sounded like a gunshot in the locker room. Some say it was a closed fist punch thrown with bad intentions, but everyone who saw it agrees on what happened next. The 280-pound superhero went down. The Ultimate Warrior, the man who shook ropes and screamed at the sky and pretended to be invincible, was knocked flat on his back. Some say he was knocked out completely. Others say he was just dazed and sitting on the floor in shock. But the result was the same. It was over in seconds. One strike from a man who knew how to hurt people, and the company's golden boy was on the ground. And the entire locker room saw it happen. They saw the Warrior's invincibility shattered by one real punch from a real fighter. The message was crystal clear. You can be the star. You can sell the merchandise. You can be Vince McMahon's chosen one. But if you disrespect the code, if you endanger your brothers, someone will put you in your place. Barry Darsow, who was there that night, later described it in an interview with a mixture of pride and matter-of-fact honesty. He said his father, meaning Roode, just beat the brakes off Warrior. And the scary part, the part that reveals how broken the system was, nothing happened to Roode. He wasn't fired. He wasn't suspended. He wasn't even yelled at by management because the WWF knew the truth that they couldn't admit publicly. They needed Rick Roode more than they needed to protect the Ultimate Warrior's ego. Without Roode to carry him, to call the matches, to make him look competent, Warrior's matches would fall apart on live television. Without someone with actual skill to guide him through 20 minutes, the superhero would be exposed as a limited performer who couldn't work. So Vince McMahon swallowed his pride, ignored the fact that his investment had been knocked out in his own locker room, and let it go. But the damage was done. The Ultimate Warrior's mystique was completely shattered among the boys in the back. Everyone knew now. He was a paper tiger, strong and intimidating on the outside, weak and helpless when it really mattered. And Rick Roode had proven something far more dangerous to the corporate structure. He was willing to hurt the company's multi-million-dollar investment to protect himself and enforce the old code. That made him powerful in a way Vince McMahon couldn't control. That's the first time Rick Roode crossed the line from performer to real threat. But it wouldn't be the last, because Rick Roode wasn't just dangerous in the locker room behind closed doors. He was dangerous on live television in front of millions of people. And in the early 90s, he was about to embarrass the WWF in a way they never saw coming. The World Wrestling Federation was desperate to be accepted by mainstream America. They wanted to shed the image of smoke-filled bingo halls and blood-soaked rings where broken men performed for broken people. They wanted to be on MTV where the young audience was. They wanted to be on morning talk shows where suburban mothers drank their coffee. They wanted parents to feel good about letting their kids watch. This was the corporate strategy. Sanitize the product, make it family-friendly, turn the wrestlers into living cartoons that couldn't possibly offend anyone. So when Regis and Kathy Lee, one of the biggest morning shows in America with an audience primarily made up of housewives, invited WWF stars to appear, it was a huge opportunity. The producers probably thought it would be harmless and fun. A couple of wrestlers in their colorful costumes. Some scripted trash talk that wouldn't go too far. Maybe one of them flexes their muscles. Everyone smiles for the camera. Everyone goes home happy. The WWF gets mainstream exposure. The talk show gets a fun segment. Perfect. But these producers didn't understand who Rick Roode was. They didn't understand that he couldn't turn his character off like flipping a switch. And they definitely didn't understand what he was planning. Rick Roode showed up to the live with Regis and Kathy Lee set with his manager Bobby the Brain Heenan. He wore his signature sequined robe that sparkled under the studio lights. The music played. The studio audience clapped politely, the way morning television audiences do. Regis and Kathy Lee smiled their practiced morning television smiles, the ones that said, "We're all friends here, and nothing bad will happen." Everything was going exactly according to plan. The segment was safe, controlled, until Rick Roode opened his mouth. He started telling the audience to quiet down. He called them fat and out of shape. He insulted them directly to their faces. This was his normal routine, the act he did in wrestling arenas full of rowdy fans who booed and threw garbage and loved every second of it. But in a bright, quiet television studio full of housewives in their best outfits, having their morning coffee and trying to enjoy a nice show, it felt aggressive. stiff, uncomfortable, wrong. The tone in the room shifted immediately, but that was just the warm-up, because Rick Rude had prepared something special for this appearance. Something the producers never saw coming. Something that would make headlines and destroy any chance of the WWF being accepted by this demographic. Rick Rude's tights were always a crucial part of his character. In front of the exact demographic they were trying to win over, and they had to grovel. Vince McMahon had to issue public apologies. He had to promise it would never happen again. He had to beg for forgiveness. But Kathie Lee Gifford became a vocal, passionate critic of wrestling after this. She called it pathetic. She called it sleazy. She told her viewers not to let their children watch it. She warned parents that this was the kind of vulgar, disgusting content their kids would be exposed to. All the mainstream acceptance the WWF wanted, all the corporate legitimacy they were chasing, all the family-friendly image they were trying to build, gone, destroyed, because Rick Rude couldn't or wouldn't filter himself for a different audience. From Rick Rude's perspective, from the mindset of a professional wrestling heel, he did his job perfectly. In wrestling, heat is the most valuable commodity a villain can generate. Heat means the audience hates you. Heat means they're emotionally invested in seeing you lose. Heat means they'll pay money to watch someone beat you up. And by offending Kathie Lee Gifford on national morning television, by creating a moment that would be talked about in newspapers and on other television shows, Rick Rude generated more heat than any scripted promo could ever create. He became the most talked about wrestler in America overnight. Every news outlet covered it. Every water cooler conversation mentioned it. Mission accomplished. He was the most hated man in America, which in wrestling terms meant he was doing his job at the highest possible level. But from the WWF's corporate perspective, from Vince McMahon's business strategy, Rick Rude was completely out of control. He proved he would prioritize his character's heat over the company's image. He proved he couldn't be trusted on live television with a mainstream audience. He proved that he was ungovernable and would do whatever he wanted regardless of the consequences. And the tights weren't just a prop or a costume choice. They were a weapon. Rick Rude had figured out how to turn his body into a billboard for psychological warfare. He forced his victims to see themselves in the most humiliating, degrading context possible. And it worked brilliantly. It got in their heads. It made them angry. It made them make mistakes. It made them uncomfortable in a way that was hard to shake. And Rick Rude would use this exact strategy again in the most personal and dangerous feud of his entire career. Jake Roberts was known as Jake the Snake. He was one of the most intelligent, cerebral wrestlers of his generation. His promos were dark and psychological. His matches told stories that made you think. He understood the mental game of wrestling better than almost anyone. And his feud with Rick Rude in 1988 was built on something most feuds carefully avoided: real life, real relationships, real consequences. Jake Roberts was married to a woman named Cheryl Roberts, and Rick Rude made the decision to pull her directly into the storyline. The angle was simple, but brutally effective. Rick Rude would hit on Cheryl Roberts at ringside while Jake watched helplessly. He would make unwanted advances in front of thousands of people. He would humiliate Jake by treating his wife like a conquest, like another trophy to be won. And to twist the psychological knife even deeper, to make it even more personal, Rick Rude had custom tights made. Airbrushed across the front was a high-quality portrait of Cheryl Roberts' face. So every single time Jake looked at Rick Rude in the ring, every time they locked up or circled each other, Jake had to see his own wife's face on another man's body. It was psychological torture disguised as entertainment, and it worked. Jake Roberts was legitimately angry. The lines between the scripted feud and real resentment, between the work and the shoot, were blurring dangerously. But things were about to get much, much worse. The angle called for a televised segment where Rick Rude would corner Cheryl Roberts in the ring and try to force a kiss on her. Simple storyline progression. She would slap him across the face. The crowd would go crazy. Jake would run in from the back for the save. Everyone goes home happy. Simple, scripted, safe, except for one critical problem. Cheryl Roberts was not a trained wrestler. She was a civilian, as they call non-wrestlers in the business. She didn't know how to throw a work slap. In professional wrestling, when you slap someone, you have to aim for the meaty, fleshy part of the cheek. You make contact just enough to create a loud sound that echoes through the arena, but you don't actually hurt the person. It's an art form. Cheryl Roberts didn't know this technique. She didn't know the mechanics. She was caught up in the moment, in the adrenaline, in the storyline. Her husband was being humiliated on television. This man was trying to kiss her in front of thousands of people. The crowd was screaming. So when it came time to slap Rick Rude, when her cue came, she didn't hold back even a little bit. She wound up with everything she had and hit him as hard as she physically could. And in the worst possible luck, her cupped hand landed in the absolute worst place it could land. Her palm struck directly over Rick Rude's ear, creating a seal of air pressure. If you've never experienced an eardrum rupture, let me explain in detail what Rick Rude felt in that instant. First came immediate, blinding, all-consuming pain, not the dull ache of a worked punch or the soreness of taking bumps. This was sharp, stabbing agony that shot through his entire head. Then came a high-pitched ringing that drowned out the crowd, the music, everything. His equilibrium was instantly destroyed. Your inner ear controls your balance, your sense of up and down, your ability to know where your body is in space. And when it's suddenly damaged, you can't tell if you're standing or falling. In his brain, the professional wrestler had disappeared completely. What stood there was the bouncer from the rough Minnesota bars, where violence was common and expected, and someone was about to pay a price. In wrestling culture, there's a sacred concept called the receipt. If you hurt your opponent, whether by accident or on purpose, whether because you're careless or unlucky, you owe them one back. It balances the scales. It maintains the code. You hurt me, I hurt you, and we're even. But Rick Rude couldn't hit Cheryl Roberts back. She was a civilian. She was a woman. She wasn't a trained worker who could take a bump. The code absolutely didn't allow hitting her no matter how angry he was. So Jake Roberts became the proxy target for Rude's rage. In all the matches that followed this incident, Rick Rude worked stiff. Really stiff. His punches landed with full force instead of being pulled. His slams had extra velocity and impact. His submissions were cranked tighter than necessary. He was punishing Jake Roberts for what his wife had done to him. And Jake, because he understood the code, because his wife had made the mistake, had to take it. That's the unspoken rule of wrestling. If your family gets involved and something goes wrong, you deal with the consequences in the ring. You take your punishment like a man. But here's the part that reveals how deep the real animosity ran. Rick Rude kept wearing the tights with Cheryl's face on them, even after the injury, even after the genuine anger, even after it stopped being a storyline and became a personal vendetta. Every single time he stepped in the ring with Jake Roberts, there was Cheryl's face airbrushed on his body. It wasn't a gimmick anymore. It wasn't just heat. It was a constant reminder, a threat, a message that said, I haven't forgotten what she did to me, and I never will. And that's when wrestling stops being a performance and starts being real-life trauma played out in front of thousands of people for money. But as dangerous as Rick Rude was in the ring, as volatile as he was on television, none of it compares to what happened after his career ended. Because when a man who has spent his entire adult life using his body to make a living, using his physical presence to define who he is, suddenly loses that body and that identity, something deep inside breaks. And for Rick Rude, that breaking point led to one of the most disturbing and dark incidents in the entire history of professional wrestling. On May 1st, 1994, Rick Rude was the WCW International World Heavyweight Champion. He was performing at the absolute peak of his abilities. He was wrestling in Japan at the Fukuoka Dome in front of thousands of fans, defending his title against Sting in what should have been just another match in a long career. The match featured a spot that had been done safely thousands of times before. Sting would perform a suicide dive, leaping over the top rope and crashing into his opponent on the floor. Rick Rude was supposed to catch him, and both men would tumble safely. Standard high-risk wrestling, but they were wrestling on a raised platform, and Rick Rude was positioned near the edge. When Sting came flying through the air and crashed into him with all that momentum, the impact drove Rick Rude backward, and his lower back struck the sharp, unforgiving edge of that raised platform with all of his weight and all of Sting's weight behind it. The damage was immediate and catastrophic. Rick Rude had shattered his C5 and C6 vertebrae. His spine was destroyed. He was stripped of the championship. And for all intents and purposes, in that single moment, Rick Rude's in-ring career was completely over. He would never wrestle a real match again. Everything that defined him, everything he had built his life around, everything that made him Rick Rude was gone. Just like that, one bad landing and it was over. The physical injury was devastating enough, but the aftermath, the bureaucratic nightmare that followed, would push Rick Rude to a breaking point that terrified everyone involved. Rick Rude had a Lloyd's of London insurance policy. These policies were common for top-level wrestlers in the 90s. The way they worked was simple but brutal. If you suffered a legitimate career-ending injury, the policy would pay out millions of dollars, a lump sum that was supposed to compensate you for losing your career. But there was a catch, a golden handcuff clause that trapped you. Once you collected that money, you could never wrestle again under any circumstances. If you returned to the ring even once, you had to pay back every single cent with interest. For a man whose entire identity was built on being a wrestler, this was an impossible choice. Take the money and lose yourself forever, or refuse the money and live in constant pain with no income and no future. Rick Rude took the money. He had to. His body was genuinely broken. But the insurance company wasn't just going to hand over millions of dollars without a fight. The payout process became contentious and drawn out. The insurance company needed absolute proof. They needed testimony that the injury was legitimate and happened exactly the way Rick Rude claimed during a sanctioned wrestling match. match. They needed verification of the mechanism of injury. They needed Sting, the only other man involved in the spot that ended Roode's career, to tell them in detail what happened. And this is where things got complicated and dangerous. According to multiple sources in the wrestling business, including wrestler Buff Bagwell, who was there in WCW at the time, Rick Rude believed that Sting wasn't being honest enough or detailed enough, lethal force, just to get an insurance company to pay him what he was legally owed. It's one of the darkest, most tragic moments in wrestling history, not because of what happened, but because of what it represents about how the business treats its workers. This moment reveals something the professional wrestling industry desperately doesn't want to talk about or acknowledge: the mental health crisis of retired wrestlers, the psychological collapse that happens when the ring is taken away. These men spend their entire adult lives in a bubble where violence is entertainment, where pain is applauded, where your worth is directly tied to how much punishment your body can absorb and keep going. You're rewarded for working through injuries. You're praised for toughness. Your value increases the more you sacrifice. And then one day, without warning, it's over. The crowd stops cheering. The paychecks stop coming. The hotel rooms and the road and the brotherhood all disappear. But the pain doesn't stop. The injuries don't heal. Your body is broken permanently, but now there's no outlet for the aggression, no ring to channel the violence, no performance to give meaning to the suffering, just a broken body and a shattered mind, and a future that looks like nothing but medical bills and depression. And the industry that made billions of dollars off your pain, that sold tickets and t-shirts and pay-per-views with your face on them, doesn't have a safety net. There's no pension plan, no health insurance that covers wrestling injuries, no counseling or therapy or support system, just a handshake, maybe, and good luck surviving. Rick Rude's decision to pull a gun on Sting wasn't about being a bad person. It wasn't about being evil or crazy. It was about a man who had been chewed up and spit out by a business that didn't care what happened to him afterward. The insurance company wanted to deny his claim and keep their money. The wrestling company wanted to distance itself from any liability. And Roode, drowning in his desperation, in his pain, resorted to the only language he had left: intimidation, force, violence. The same tools that had made him a star were now the only tools he had to try to survive. And that's the real tragedy of Rick Rude's story. But Rick Rude wasn't finished with wrestling yet. Even broken and retired and fighting insurance companies, he still had one more moment left in him. One final act that would change the wrestling industry forever and cement his legacy as the most ungovernable man to ever step in a ring. And this time, he didn't need violence. He didn't need to punch anyone or pull a gun. He just needed a razor, a television camera, and absolutely perfect timing. On November 9th, 1997, one of the most controversial and talked about moments in professional wrestling history happened in Montreal, Canada. It's called the Montreal Screwjob, and it changed everything. Bret Hart, one of the biggest stars in the WWF and arguably the best pure wrestler in the world, was leaving the company to join WCW. He was still the WWF champion, and there was a problem. Bret refused to lose the championship in Canada, his home country where he was a national hero. He had creative control written into his contract, and he was going to use it. Vince McMahon didn't trust Bret to return the championship belt when he left, so McMahon came up with a plan. During Bret's final match against Shawn Michaels, the referee would ring the bell and award the match, even though Bret never submitted. It was a real double cross, a real betrayal, broadcast live to millions. And it sent shockwaves through not just the WWF locker room, but the entire wrestling industry. Rick Rude, who was working for the WWF as a member of D-Generation X, was a close personal friend of Bret Hart. He had traveled with Bret, trained with Bret, respected Bret as one of the few men in the business who still believed in the code, and he watched the Screwjob happen live. He watched Vince McMahon betray everything the locker room was supposed to stand for. And Rick Rude decided immediately that he was done with the WWF forever. But Rick Rude didn't just quit. He didn't just turn in his notice and walk away quietly. He weaponized the WWF's entire production schedule against them in the most brilliant and humiliating way possible. Here's exactly what happened. On November 10th, 1997, one day after the Screwjob, Rick Rude appeared at a WWF television taping in Ottawa, Canada. This episode of Monday Night Raw would be taped to air 1 week later on November 17th. At this taping, Rick Rude stood in the ring as part of D-Generation X with Shawn Michaels. The cameras filmed him, and he was wearing a full, thick beard. The taping ended. The footage was recorded. It was in the can, ready to air the following week. And immediately after that taping, Rick Rude called Eric Bischoff at WCW and negotiated a contract. He was jumping ship to the enemy. But he had one more brilliant trick to play, because November 17th wasn't just the night his WWF appearance would air on tape. It was also the night WCW Monday Nitro aired live, and Rick Rude was going to appear on both shows on the same night at the exact same time and prove to the entire world that WWF's show was taped while WCW was live. Here's exactly how the greatest wrestling moment of Betrayal went down. At 9 p.m. Eastern Time, WWF Monday Night Raw began airing on USA Network. It was the taped episode from Ottawa. Rick Rude appeared on screen standing in the ring with Shawn Michaels and the rest of D-Generation X, wearing his full beard, talking about how great the WWF was. McMahon had failed to lock down his talent, and Rick Rude exploited that failure to maximum effect. The fallout from this moment permanently changed the legal structure of professional wrestling contracts. Vince McMahon was humiliated in front of the world, but he learned his lesson the hard way. From that point forward, every single WWF and later WWE contract included an ironclad 90-day non-compete clause that couldn't be negotiated away. If you were released from the company, if you quit, if your contract expired, you couldn't appear on rival television programming for 3 full months. This rule effectively killed the element of surprise for any defecting talent. No more showing up the next week. No more jumping ship with all your momentum intact. No more surprise returns that pop the crowd. The Rick Rude clause, as it became known in the industry, was created specifically and directly because of this incident. Rick Rude had embarrassed the most powerful man in wrestling, and Vince McMahon made absolutely certain it would never happen to him again. But for one brief, glorious, perfect moment, Rick Rude had proven that even broken and retired and working on borrowed time, he could still control the narrative. He didn't need his muscles or his wrestling ability or a championship belt. He just needed a razor to change his facial hair and the absolute arrogance to believe he could humiliate Vince McMahon on live television in front of the whole world. And he was completely right. So what do these 5 moments tell us about Rick Rude? What do they reveal about the man behind the character, about Richard Rude behind ravishing Rick Rude? They tell us that he was a man who fundamentally refused to be controlled by anyone. In a business built entirely on exploitation, where promoters legally owned the intellectual property rights to your ring name and your character, where they controlled all the outcomes and decided who won and lost, where they often completely disregarded the health and safety of the laborers who made them millions. Rick Rude asserted his agency through extreme and often dangerous means. When the Ultimate Warrior threatened his physical safety and the safety of everyone in the locker room, when management refused to step in and protect the workers, Rick Rude utilized his legitimate fighting skills to enforce safety standards. When Kathy Lee Gifford and the WWF offered him a sanitized, family-friendly platform to promote the company, Rude hijacked it to force his unfiltered, inappropriate, deliberately offensive persona into the mainstream, regardless of the public relations cost. When Cheryl Roberts and the WWF machine accidentally inflicted a serious injury on him, Rude channeled his real-world rage and pain directly into the performance, blurring the lines between the scripted feud and genuine violence until it became legitimately threatening to everyone involved. When his career ended in that ring in Japan and his financial survival was threatened by insurance companies and testimony, Rude reportedly resorted to the ultimate equalizer, a loaded firearm, demonstrating the absolute lengths he would go to in order to survive. And when Vince McMahon betrayed the sacred locker room code in Montreal, when McMahon proved that loyalty meant nothing and business was everything, Rude exploited the broadcast schedule and his contractual loophole to humiliate the promoter and rewrite the rules of wrestling contracts forever. These weren't the actions of a hero. Rick Rude was not a good guy. These were the actions of a man who had been pushed too far, too many times by too many people who saw him as a commodity instead of a human being. A man who understood that in the wrestling business, if you let them, they will use your body until it breaks and then throw you away without a second thought. So Rick Rude made absolutely certain he couldn't be used that way. He made himself dangerous in ways that went beyond the scripted violence. He made himself unpredictable in an industry that demanded predictability. He made himself ungovernable in a system built entirely on control. And while his methods were often extreme, sometimes violent, sometimes genuinely terrifying to the people around him, they all came from the same place: survival. Rick Rude knew from watching the broken men who came before him that if he played by their rules, if he trusted the promoters to take care of him, if he believed their promises about taking care of the boys, he would end up broken and forgotten and poor. So he made his own rules. He protected himself and his brothers when management wouldn't or couldn't. He created his own heat and his own value when the storylines weren't enough to keep him relevant. He fought for his money when the system actively tried to cheat him out of what he earned. And he humiliated the promoters when they betrayed the code that was supposed to bind everyone together. Rick Rude died on April 20th, 1999. He was only 40 years old. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but anyone who knew the wrestling business understood the real cause. Years and years of anabolic steroids to maintain the physique that made him marketable. Years of pain pills and muscle relaxers to deal with the injuries that never healed properly. Years of physical and psychological physical stress from being the man who could never turn it off, who carried the weight of the code on his shoulders. His heart gave out, overwhelmed by the chemical cocktail and the damage, and the wrestling world lost one of its most complex and fascinating figures. Rick Rude was never the biggest star in the business. He never held the WWF championship that Vince McMahon reserved for his chosen few. He never main evented WrestleMania, but he was completely unforgettable to anyone who saw him work. Because in a business built entirely on fakery, Rick Rude was dangerously, thrillingly, terrifyingly real, and that made him magnetic in ways the manufactured stars could never match. When Rick Rude was on your television screen, you genuinely didn't know what would happen next. Would he stick to the script, or would tonight be the night he went off? Would this be a performance, or would this be the night he snapped and someone got hurt? That unpredictability, that edge of danger, that possibility that at any moment the work could become a shoot, made him one of the most effective heels in the history of professional wrestling. People paid money to see him. They bought tickets, hoping to see him get beaten up. They tuned in every week to see what he would do next. But Rick Rude is also a cautionary tale that the wrestling business still hasn't learned from. The lesson of Rick Rude is brutally simple. When you build an entire business model on exploiting people's bodies, when you ask them to blur the line between reality and performance every single night, when you give them no safety net and no respect, and treat them like independent contractors so you don't have to provide benefits, eventually someone will refuse to play along. Eventually someone will say no. Eventually someone will fight back. Rick Rude was that someone. He was the shooter in a worked world, the real fighter in a scripted show, the man who couldn't and wouldn't be controlled no matter what they did to him. And while his methods were often extreme, while they were sometimes violent and dangerous and crossed lines that maybe shouldn't be crossed, they came from a place of desperate survival. Rick Rude knew that the only person who would protect Rick Rude was Rick Rude himself. So he did. With his fists, with his words, with his weapons, with his brilliance, he protected himself and his legacy and his code. And in doing so, he became unforgettable.